Okay, we're looking at proportional representation. So as I think I've probably mentioned, I forget what I talked about with which class, but proportional representation is something that you hear about fairly often in the media, or whenever we get around election time, people talk about it. They talk about election reform, and one of the ways they look at reforming our electoral system is by moving to proportional representation. We currently use a plurality method, but a lot of people promote proportional representation as the preferred method. So what they've done in this question is they've given us the results of the last federal election, and they've summarized it for you. I don't know if I'll write out all the numbers here, but anyway, so we're looking at question 12, and it shows us each party and the number of votes they got. So we've got the information tabulated. If we look at the process or the procedure that they give us, we've already got the number of votes for each party, so that's step 1. So we need to go, step 2 is to find the total votes. And so we add them all up, and we end up with 17,810,860 votes is the total number of votes. Then step 3 is to take the votes that each party got and figure out what percentage of the vote they got as a decimal. So we'll start off with the Liberals, and they got, what is it, 6,018,728 votes. We divide that by 17,810,860, and we get 0.3379. Then we do the same for the Conservatives. They got 6,239,227 votes, divided by 17,810,860, which gives them 0.3503. And then the Bloc got 1,387,030 votes, divided by 17,810,860, which gives them 0.0779. The NDP, 2,903,722, divided by 17,810,860, which gives them 0.1630. The Greens, finally, have 1,189,607, divided by the total gives them 0.0668. And then finally the Independents, which they're sort of treated as a group here, but they really have no connection between each other. 72,546 divided by the total 17,810,860, which is 0.0041. Okay, so we figured out by doing this, we've got the proportion that each of the total vote that each party got. If we added up all those decimals, we should end up with 1, or very, very close to it. If I've done my rounding correctly, we should end up at 1. Now, once we've got that, we move on to step 4. So now we're at step 4. We take those proportions, and we're going to multiply each of them times the number of seats that are available. So we're told that there are 338 seats. So we multiply this decimal times 338, and we get the number of seats that they need, that they should be assigned. Okay, so 338 times 0.3379 gives us 114.21. And the Conservatives, following the same approach, 0.3503 times 338 gives us 118.40, and so on down the list. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is add up all of just the whole numbers. So in this case, we're taking a look, we ignore the decimals, and we just add up, just the whole number parts of each of those answers. So if we add those up, 114, 118, 26, 55, 22, and 1, and we should end up with 336. Now the key thing to note there is that 336 is less than the total of 338 seats that we're supposed to have assigned. So we need to do something about that. And that's where the next step in the process comes in. So what we've done is we've just taken the whole numbers. So we've got 114, 118, 26, 55, 22, and 1. Those are the seats that have currently been assigned. However, we've got 338 minus 336, which is equal to 2. So we've got 2 seats left over that still need to be assigned. The process says that what we do is we look to the decimals of every entry. So look to all the decimals and look for the one that's next, that's biggest. So in this case, if we look at this, we've got a 0.58, 0.10, 0.33, 0.40. So the 0.58 here is the largest decimal. So that means we're going to add one more seat. So one more seat goes to the greens. Then we look for the next biggest decimal. And in this case, it's the conservatives at 0.40. So they get one more seat added. So then we can total everything up. So we've got 114, 119, 26, 55, 23, and 1. And when we add all that up, that'll give us the 338 seats that we're supposed to have at the end. So that's our final outcome. The reason we follow this method, as opposed to the first reaction would be typically to do the rounding up here. The problem with that is that if you followed the rules of rounding, you wouldn't end up allocating all of the seats. The only one that would have rounded up would have been the greens. At 22.58, that would round up to 23. But none of the others have a decimal that's over 0.5. So none of them would have rounded up. We would have ended up with one empty seat. So by following through this process of ignoring the decimals at the start, then allocating extra seats based on whoever has the largest decimal, that then ensures that we allocate all of the seats appropriately. So a couple of key things to keep in mind is you want to have, when you get to this level of calculation, because those decimals become important, you want to make sure that you've got at least 2 decimal places there. If we had been rounding to just 1 decimal place, we would have ended up with this and the independents both rounding up to 1.4. So you wouldn't have known where to allocate the extra seat. So you're going to need at least that 1 extra decimal place, so at least 2 decimal places. Arguably, it's probably better to have more, but at least you need at least 2 in most cases to make sure you're getting an accurate summary. Okay, so that was 12A. The question then, 12B, came up to say, okay, the actual number of seats are shown here. So these are the seats that we, by proportional representation, would have been allocated. Right, so these are the seats that we wanted to see allocated using proportional representation. However, in our actual electoral system, where we're using a riding system with a plurality voting method, that's not what we ended up with. So what they're showing you in the next table is what we actually have. So in question B, it shows you that the Liberals got 157 seats, the Conservatives got 121, the Bloc Québécois got 32, the NDP got 24, the Greens got 3, and the Independents got 1 seat. So some of that matches up. The Independents got 1 seat in the proportional method as well. But look at how much difference you get for the Liberals. They got 114 votes under proportional voting, but if you look at the actual number of seats that were allocated to them, they were actually allocated 157 seats. So there's a difference there of 43 seats. If we subtract there, we end up with 43 seat difference. Looking at the Conservatives, they were allocated 121 seats, so they only see a slight difference. They would drop by 2 seats, so there's -2, -43. The Bloc Québécois were allocated 32 seats, so they're going down 6 seats. The NDP got 24 seats, So in their case, they would have really, really benefited from proportional representation. They'd go up by 31 seats. They would more than double their presence in the House of Commons. Green Party got 23 seats. Sorry, the Greens only got 3 seats, but under proportional representation would have had 23. So they'd go up by 1. And as we said, the independents wouldn't change at all. They'd still just have 1 seat allocated, so there would be no change there. So when it comes to electoral reform, which is what Prime Minister Trudeau was talking about when he was running under the last election, or maybe I guess it was the first time they got reelected. They said they were going to introduce electoral reform, and they set up a commission to study it. And the commission was leaning towards proportional representation. So the Liberals said, "Thank you very much. I think we're done with electoral reform. Let's put that on the shelf." And the reason, of course, is exactly what you see here. If you look at the numbers, in the last election, the Conservatives actually got more votes than the Liberals. But we've got a Liberal government because the way our riding system is set up to work, they got more seats, right? They got the 157 seats versus 121 seats. So it makes a big difference in what method you're using to count votes. The Liberals, in this case, would be the biggest losers in this election, not always. They would have been the biggest losers if we'd gone to a proportional voting system. If we'd gone to proportional voting, we would have ended up with a Conservative government. However, they wouldn't have the majority of the votes. So we'd have a Conservative minority government, unless, of course, the Liberals and the Bloc, or the Liberals and the NDP, decided to form a coalition, in which case then they'd have more votes than the Conservatives. So this is some of the chaos that gets introduced when you go to different voting systems. There are some definite drawbacks to our plurality system, but moving to a proportional representation also introduces some issues. When you have a large number of parties, the likelihood that you will have a coalition government or always a minority government situation gets to be very high. This is what's happened in Israel. I think they've had 6 elections in 4 years or something really, really crazy. So it makes for a really unstable government. You can't do any long-term planning. Lots of chaos. Anyway, so that's proportional representation. It has some great benefits because it represents your population better in some ways, but then you end up with the drawbacks of having minority governments more and coalition governments a lot.